The gunner's hatch slammed shut 3 seconds before the Panther's 88 tore through the exact position where his head had been, and in that instant, Staff Sergeant Daniel Kowalski understood that breaking the cardinal rule of tank warfare had just saved his life. Nobody closes the hatch during visual acquisition. Nobody, but he did it anyway, and the ricochet screamed across the turret exterior like a banshee while he was already traversing left, counting degrees in his head, his hand steady on the firing mechanism, even as every regulation he'd ever learned told him he'd just made a fatal mistake. December 1944, the Ardennes forest, 60 miles of frozen hell where the Wehrmacht was making its final, desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and retake Antwerp. Kowalski's Sherman, designation Easy 7, was part of the 4th Armored Division's push to relieve Bastogne, and they were supposed to be providing covering fire from a reverse slope position, standard doctrine, safe doctrine. But doctrine didn't account for the fact that an entire Panzer Battalion had materialized from the tree line like ghosts, and doctrine certainly didn't account for what Kowalski was about to do. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker who'd come over from Krakow in 1923. The old man had taught him that rules existed for a reason, that structure and discipline separated civilization from chaos. Daniel had carried that lesson through basic training at Fort Knox, through gunnery school, through the hedgerows of Normandy, where Easy 7 had earned its reputation as the most reliable tank in the company. 3 different crews had rotated through other positions, but Kowalski remained the gunner. Captain Morrison said it was because Daniel had a gift for geometry, for calculating deflection and range in his head faster than most men could work a slide rule. But the truth was simpler, and Kowalski understood that every round fired carried the weight of other men. He never, ever missed. The first Panther had appeared at 1,400 yards, hull down behind a burned-out farmhouse. Lieutenant Hayes, commanding from the tank commander's position, had called for a ranging shot. Procedure said wait for the loader to confirm the round type, wait for the driver to position for optimal firing angle, wait for the commander to clear the shot. Kowalski had fired before Hayes finished his sentence. The armor-piercing round caught the Panther in the mantlet, and the German tank brewed up so fast that the crew never even opened their hatches. Hayes had been furious, screaming into the intercom about chain of command and court-martial offenses, but his tirade died when 2 more Panthers emerged from positions that would have had perfect shots on Easy 7 if they hadn't been distracted by their companion's destruction. That should have been the lesson. Breaking procedure had worked once, don't make it a habit. But something had shifted in Kowalski's mind during that first engagement. He'd seen the pattern, the way the German armor moved with practiced coordination, the way they used terrain and timing to create kill zones that turned American Shermans into coffins. The regulations were designed for a different kind of war, a war of set-piece battles and clear sightlines. This wasn't that war. This was survival mathematics, and the numbers only worked if you thought 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still confirming the first. The second rule he broke was ammunition selection. The book said use armor-piercing for tanks, high explosive for soft targets, and always wait for the loader to verbal confirm the round type before firing. But Kowalski had spent his evenings studying German armor doctrine, reading intelligence reports that most gunners ignored, learning the difference between a Panther's frontal armor and its side profile, memorizing the exact thickness of a Tiger's turret ring. He started calling his own loads, bypassing the confirmation protocol, trusting his memory and his math over the established system. The loader, a farm kid from Iowa named Jimmy Reese, had protested exactly once. Then he'd seen Kowalski punch through a Panzer Hufalles' thickest armor with a shot that shouldn't have penetrated, and after that, Reese just loaded what was called for without question. By the time they reached the approaches to Bastogne, Easy 7 had confirmed kills on 11 German tanks. That was more than some entire platoons could claim, but the numbers came with a cost. The rest of the company had started giving them distance, both literally and socially. Other crews didn't want to operate near a tank whose gunner ignored commands, and whose commander had apparently lost control of his own crew. There were rumors that Hayes had requested a transfer, that Division was investigating Kowalski for insubordination, that Easy 7 would be pulled from the line and its crews scattered to different units. None of it mattered when the shooting started, but in the quiet moments between engagements, Kowalski could feel the isolation like a physical weight. December 22nd. The weather had cleared enough for air support, but the ground was frozen solid, and the Germans were dug in deeper than anyone had anticipated. Easy 7 was assigned to a reconnaissance in force, probing the enemy lines to identify weak points for the main assault. They were third in a column of 5 Shermans, moving through a narrow valley with steep wooded ridges on both sides. Every instinct Kowalski possessed was screaming ambush, but the orders were clear. advance to the designated checkpoint, and report enemy positions. He'd already rotated the turret 30 degrees off the center line, tracking the ridge to their right where the trees were thickest, when the world exploded. The lead Sherman took a round through the engine compartment and lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its vents. The second tank tried to reverse but threw a track on the ice and slewed sideways, blocking the trail. That's when Kowalski saw them. 8 Panthers, perfectly positioned in a horseshoe ambush that would turn the valley into a killing field. The German tanks were hull down, showing only their turrets and guns, their positions carefully chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire with minimal exposure. It was textbook Panzer tactics, and it was absolutely devastating. Hayes was already screaming for the driver to back up, but Kowalski knew they'd never make it. The moment EZ-7's engine note changed, the Panthers would shift focus and tear them apart. So he did the unthinkable. He fired on a friendly position. The high-explosive round hit the disabled Sherman's turret, detonating the ready ammunition and creating a fireball that filled the entire valley with smoke and debris. Hayes' screaming reached a pitch that was barely human, but Kowalski was already traversing right, calling for armor piercing, his eye pressed to the sight as he searched the ridge through the artificial fog he'd just created. The Panthers couldn't see through the smoke any better than EZ-7 could, but Kowalski had counted their positions before he'd fired, had memorized the exact locations, and now he was shooting blind based on geometry and faith. The first round went into the smoke at what should have been empty air. 2 seconds later, they heard the secondary explosion. He'd hit something. Reese was loading like a machine, not questioning, not hesitating, just feeding rounds into the breach as fast as Kowalski could fire. Second shot, third, fourth, each one calculated based on remembered positions and estimated corrections for wind and the slope of the ridge. Somewhere in the chaos, Hayes had stopped screaming and started calling corrections, his training overriding his rage, his voice steady as he fed Kowalski adjustments based on muzzle flashes visible through gaps in the smoke. When the smoke cleared, 3 Panthers were burning, 2 more had pulled back into deeper cover, and the remaining 3 were repositioning, trying to re-establish their ambush pattern, but the moment had passed. EZ-7 and the 2 surviving Shermans had broken contact, falling back to a defensive position where American artillery could provide cover. The cost was 1 tank destroyed, the one Kowalski had deliberately fired upon. 4 men dead because their gunner had turned their own armor into a smokescreen. Hayes had submitted him for court-martial before they'd even returned to the assembly area. The investigation took 3 days. Kowalski spent them under guard, confined to the company area while officers reviewed radio transcripts and interviewed witnesses. The rules were clear. Firing on friendly forces was a capital offense, regardless of circumstances or outcomes. The fact that he'd potentially saved 2 crews didn't erase the fact that he'd killed 4 men from his own unit. The legal officer, a captain from Division JAG, had explained it very carefully. Intent didn't matter, results didn't matter, only the action mattered. Kowalski would face a general court-martial, and if convicted, he could be executed by firing squad. But war has its own logic, and the logic of the Ardennes didn't care about regulation. On December 26th, German forces launched a massive counterattack against the exact position where EZ-7's reconnaissance had identified their staging area. Because of Kowalski's engagement, Division knew the Panthers were there, knew their numbers and dispositions, and had positioned anti-tank guns and artillery accordingly. The counterattack shattered against prepared defenses, losing 27 tanks in 4 hours. The breakthrough that might have cut off the relief of Bastogne never materialized. When the smoke cleared, someone high up the chain of command made a calculation. 1 gunner who broke every rule was worth more than a symbolic execution. The charges were dropped on December 28th. No explanation, no apology, just orders reassigning Kowalski back to EZ-7. Hayes was gone, transferred to a training battalion in England. The new TC was a lieutenant named Kowalski didn't know, a veteran of the Sicily campaign who'd earned a Silver Star and a reputation for letting his crews operate however they fought best. His first words to Kowalski were simple. "I don't care about your methods. I care about results. Show me results." If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Ardennes, offensive ground on into January, and EZ-7 was in every major engagement. Kowalski continued to break rules with methodical precision, and his crew followed him without question because they understood that conventional wisdom was designed for conventional warfare, and nothing about the winter of 1945 was conventional. He developed a new doctrine based on speed and aggression, firing before the enemy expected, moving before they could range him, trusting his calculations over established procedure. The math was brutal, but simple. Hesitation killed more tank crews than any enemy gun. January 7th near Hufalles, 7th near. Easy 7 was supporting an infantry advance when they encountered a King Tiger, the massive German heavy tank that outweighed a Sherman by 30 tons and mounted an 88mm gun that could penetrate American armor at ranges where return fire was impossible. Doctrine said withdraw and call for air support or tank destroy. Kowalski killed it at 400 yards with 3 shots to the turret ring, a target less than 6 inches wide, firing while Easy 7 was moving at 15 miles per hour over broken ground. The after-action report described it as luck. The crew knew better, but breaking rules came with consequences that couldn't be calculated in trajectory tables or armor penetration charts. The psychological cost of operating outside the system, of making decisions that killed friendly soldiers and enemy combatants with the same mathematical dispassion, was accumulating in ways Kowalski couldn't entirely understand. He stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch. He stopped eating anything that required him to sit down for longer than it took to swallow. He stopped talking except to call fire commands or acknowledge orders. The crew noticed, but nobody said anything because Kowalski's detachment was keeping them alive, and survival trumped mental health in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. The engagement that would define Easy 7's legend came on January 16th, during the reduction of the Hufalles pocket. American forces were squeezing the German salient from both sides, and the Wehrmacht was fighting with the desperation of men who understood they were staring at absolute defeat. Easy 7 was part of a combined arms task force, 5 Shermans and 2 companies of infantry, assigned to clear a road junction that intelligence said was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. The junction was held by elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, including at least a dozen tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by infantry with Panzerfaust and fighting from prepared positions. The task force commander, a major who'd arrived from the States 3 weeks earlier, ordered a frontal assault. Standard tactics: infantry fixes the enemy, armor provides mobile fire support, artillery softens defensive positions before the final push. It was doctrine perfect and suicidal, and Kowalski knew it the moment he heard the order. The Germans had chosen their ground well, positioning their armor in depth, with clear firing lanes and multiple fallback positions. A frontal assault would massacre the infantry and destroy every Sherman before they even reached effective range. Kowalski requested permission to speak on the command net. The major denied him. Kowalski requested again, and again was denied. The third time, the major told him that if he spoke out of turn one more time, he'd be removed from his tank and placed under arrest. So Kowalski stopped asking permission. He switched to the platoon frequency and laid out his plan in 30 seconds of precise, emotionless description. Then he told his driver to execute, and Easy 7 broke formation before the assault even began. They went wide, flanking through terrain that the major had declared impassable for armor, using a creek bed that was barely wider than the Sherman's tracks. The ride was violent enough to crack 2 teeth when Kowalski's jaw slammed into the gun sight, but it put them 300 yards behind the German defensive line, while the rest of the task force was still forming up for the frontal assault. The new lieutenant didn't say a word, just braced himself in the turret and started calling targets as they emerged into the German rear area. The next 7 minutes were pure chaos. Easy 7 appeared behind the SS position like a ghost, and Kowalski started killing tanks from the rear where their armor was thinnest, and their crews were focused on the expected American approach. First kill, a Panzer IV, 1 shot through the engine compartment. Second kill, a Stuggy 3, caught while repositioning, the round penetrating the casemate and detonating the ammunition. Third, fourth, fifth, the German position collapsed into confusion as tanks that should have been safe in prepared positions found themselves taking fire from an impossible direction. The rest of the American task force exploited the chaos exactly as Kowalski had calculated, pushing through the disrupted defensive line and securing the junction with minimal casualties. But Easy 7 had penetrated too far into enemy territory, and now they were cut off, surrounded by German infantry and the remnants of the SS armor that had survived the initial onslaught. The major ordered them to withdraw. The lieutenant asked Kowalski if that was possible. Kowalski's answer was a single word: no. They were trapped in a small clearing, ringed by forests that concealed an unknown number of enemy soldiers. The Sherman's ammunition was running low, and they'd taken damage to the suspension that made anything faster than a crawl impossible. Doctrine said surrender or fight to the last round, then scuttle the tank to prevent capture. Kowalski had a different idea. He ordered the driver to position Easy 7 with its rear against a large boulder that would prevent flanking from that direction, then told Reese to start mixing ammunition loads: 1 armor-piercing, 1 high explosive, alternating. The lieutenant understood immediately. They were going to turn EZ-7 into a stationary fortress and dare the Germans to come dig them out. The SS obliged. They started with infantry probes, trying to get close enough to use Panzerfausts against the Sherman's thinner side armor. Kowalski killed them with high-explosive rounds set to airburst, turning the 75mm gun into an anti-personnel weapon that scythed through the forest. When the Germans brought up a Panther to provide supporting fire, he switched to armor-piercing and put 2 rounds through its glacis plate before it could even traverse its main gun. The wreck burned between EZ-7 and the German positions, creating a barrier and a signal fire that drew American artillery. They held that position for 4 hours. The crew never left the tank, never opened the hatches except to clear jams and toss out spent shell casings. The interior temperature climbed above 90 degrees from the gun firing, then dropped below freezing when the engine finally sputtered out and they lost power. They rationed ammunition 1 round at a time, Kowalski making every shot count because every miss brought them closer to the moment when the gun would click on an empty breech. Reese was loading with hands that bled from friction burns. The driver was semi-conscious from carbon monoxide exposure. The lieutenant had taken shrapnel through the shoulder when a German anti-tank round had penetrated the turret basket but failed to detonate, and Kowalski just kept shooting, methodical, precise. Each target selected with the same cold mathematics that had defined his entire combat career. He wasn't thinking about the rules he'd broken, or the men he'd killed, or the consequences waiting for him if he survived. He was thinking about angles and distances, about the way a tank's armor reacts to different projectiles at different velocities, about the geometry of death reduced to numbers and trajectories. It was the only way he could keep functioning, the only way to hold back the reality of what he'd become. American forces broke through to EZ-7 just before dark. The relief column found the Sherman still operational, still fighting, surrounded by 11 destroyed German tanks and an estimated 80 dead SS infantry. Kowalski had fired 73 rounds from the main gun and several hundred from the coaxial machine gun. When they finally opened the hatches and pulled the crew out, Kowalski couldn't stand. His legs had cramped so severely from maintaining the same firing position for 4 hours that the medics thought he'd been wounded. They carried him to an aid station, and he didn't speak for 2 days. The legend of EZ-7 spread through the 4th Armored like wildfire, the tank that had single-handedly destroyed a Panzer Battalion, the gunner who broke every rule and won anyway, the crew that had held an impossible position against impossible odds. Journalists wanted interviews, Division wanted to use them for morale purposes, the Pentagon wanted to study Kowalski's tactics for possible incorporation into doctrine. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted to package it into something inspiring and heroic that would look good in newspapers and newsreels. But Kowalski wasn't a hero. He was a man who'd learned to kill with slide rule precision, who'd sacrificed friendships and regulations and pieces of his own humanity in exchange for survival. The rules existed to maintain discipline, to preserve the chain of command, to ensure that soldiers operated as cohesive units instead of individuals making independent decisions. Kowalski had broken those rules systematically and deliberately, and the fact that it had worked didn't change the fundamental truth. He'd undermined the entire structure that held a military together. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Army's response was characteristically contradictory. They awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the Hufalles engagement, the second highest decoration for valor, presented at a ceremony where he stood at attention while a general pinned the medal to his uniform and photographers captured the moment for posterity. Then they quietly reassigned him to a training battalion in the States, effective immediately, removing him from combat operations before he could further destabilize unit cohesion with his maverick tactics. The rest of EZ-7's crew was scattered to different units. The Sherman itself was shipped back to a depot for study by Army Ordnance, who wanted to understand how a single tank had absorbed so much damage and remained operational. Kowalski spent the rest of the war teaching new gunners at Fort Knox, drilling them on the same regulations and procedures he'd systematically violated in combat. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every morning, he'd stand in front of a classroom full of 18-year-old kids and explain the importance of following established doctrine, of maintaining discipline, of trusting the chain of command. And every night he'd lie in his bunk and remember the feeling of pressing his eye to the gun sight, calculating trajectories that would send men to their deaths, breaking rules that would keep other men alive. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Kowalski was still at Fort Knox, still teaching, still carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be reduced to right or wrong. The Army offered him a promotion to warrant officer and a permanent assignment as a gunnery instructor. He declined. They offered him an early discharge with full benefits. He accepted. By September, he was back in Pittsburgh, living in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up, working in the same steel mill as his father. He never talked about the war. When people asked, and they always asked when they saw the medals in their box on his dresser, he'd give short, factual answers that contained no emotional content. Yes, he'd been a tank gunner. Yes, he'd seen combat. No, he didn't want to discuss the details. Most people assumed it was trauma, the kind of psychological damage that affected so many combat veterans. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Kowalski's silence wasn't about suppressing memories. It was about the impossibility of explaining what it meant to operate outside the rules, to make decisions that saved lives by ending other lives, to carry the knowledge that success and failure were sometimes separated by nothing more than luck and geometry. The Korean War started in 1950, and the Army sent him a letter asking if he'd consider returning to active duty. They needed experienced armor personnel, men who understood combat operations against enemy tanks, who could train the new generation facing Soviet-built T-34s in the hills of Korea. Kowalski sent back a one-word response: no. They tried again in 1951, offering a direct commission and command of a tank battalion. He didn't bother responding to that one. Years passed. The nightmares faded but never disappeared entirely. Once a month, maybe twice, he'd wake up with his hands clenched around phantom fire controls, his body rigid with the muscle memory of combat operations, his mind running calculations for targets that existed only in memory. His wife, a woman named Catherine, who he'd married in 1948, learned to recognize the signs. She'd turn on the light, sit with him until his breathing steadied, and never ask questions about what he'd seen or done. Some things didn't need words. He read about armor doctrine in the decades that followed, tracked the evolution of tank warfare through Vietnam and into the Cold War. Some of his methods had been incorporated into official training, though never with credit to their source. The idea of aggressive flanking maneuvers, of prioritizing speed and surprise over positional security, of empowering gunners to make independent firing decisions in fast-moving combat situations, all of it could be traced back to the winter of 1945 and a Sherman designated EZ-7. The military had learned that sometimes breaking the rules produced better results than following them, but they'd learned it carefully, systematically, incorporating the lessons while maintaining the appearance of doctrinal consistency. In 1984, a military historian from the Army's Center of Military History contacted Kowalski. They were compiling an official history of armor operations during the Battle of the Bulge, and EZ-7's engagement at Hufalles was a significant case study. Would he be willing to be interviewed, to provide first-hand accounts of the tactical decisions and combat actions? The historian explained that his testimony would be invaluable, that it would help future generations of soldiers understand the realities of armored warfare. Kowalski agreed to one interview, 3 hours in a hotel conference room in Pittsburgh, his words recorded on cassette tapes that would eventually be filed in the National Archives. He told them everything: the rules he'd broken, the men he'd killed, the calculations he'd made that treated human lives as variables in equations. The historian asked if he regretted any of it. Kowalski considered the question for a long time before answering. Regret implied that he'd had better options, that different choices would have produced superior outcomes. But the mathematics of combat didn't work that way. Every decision had costs and benefits, and the goal was to minimize friendly casualties while maximizing enemy losses. He'd achieved that goal more effectively than any gunner in his division, maybe in the entire European theater. The cost was living with the knowledge of how he'd done it. "I did what the situation required," he finally said. "Whether I regret it is irrelevant." The historian published a portion of the interview in a journal article about tactical innovation during World War II. Kowalski's name appeared in footnotes, his actions described in clinical language that stripped away the blood and fear and moral complexity. It was probably the most accurate representation of his service that would ever be recorded: efficient, effective, and fundamentally inhuman in its reduction of combat to numbers and outcomes. Catherine died in 1993, cancer that the doctors caught too late to treat. Kowalski buried her in the same cemetery where his parents rested, under a simple headstone that gave her name and dates and nothing else. He'd never been good with words, never been able to express emotions in ways that others found comforting or meaningful. What he'd been good at was geometry and violence, and those skills had no application in the decades of peace that followed his war. He lived another 15 years, alone in the house they'd shared, surviving on a steelworker's pension and VA benefits. The neighborhood changed around him, the mills closing one by one, the families he'd known moving away or dying off. He became a fixture, the old man who sat on his porch and watched the street, who nodded politely to neighbors but never initiated conversations. Kids in the neighborhood called him the tank guy, because of the single photograph he kept on his mantle. EZ-7 and its crew, taken in January 1945, the Sherman's gun barrel still hot from recent firing, the men's faces showing exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. In 2008, a reporter from a Pittsburgh newspaper contacted him for a Veterans Day feature story. They wanted to profile local Tarus veterans, to capture their stories before that generation disappeared entirely. Kowalski declined, as he declined every other request for interviews or public appearances in the 63 years since the war ended. But the reporter was persistent, explaining that this wasn't about glorifying war or creating heroes. It was about preserving memory, about ensuring that the sacrifices of his generation weren't forgotten. Kowalski finally agreed to answer written questions submitted by mail, with the understanding that he retained final approval over anything public. The questions were predictable. What was combat like? Were you afraid? What did you think about when you were in action? How did you cope with the stress? Kowalski answered them honestly, perhaps more honestly than he'd ever answered similar questions before. He was 84 years old, living on borrowed time, and he'd long since stopped caring about how people perceived him or his service. Combat was mathematics applied at lethal. Fear was irrelevant, because acting on it got you killed faster than ignoring it. During engagements, he thought about angles, deflection, range, and ammunition selection. Coping wasn't something he'd ever managed successfully. He just learned to function despite the weight he carried. The reporter published his answers verbatim, and the article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. It generated exactly 3 responses: a letter from a Korean War veteran thanking him for his honesty, a phone call from a military academy professor requesting permission to use the interview in a class on combat psychology, and a visit from another 4th Armored Division veteran who'd heard about the article and wanted to meet the legendary EZ-7 gunner. The veteran's name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been a loader on another Sherman in the same company. They sat on Kowalski's porch and talked for 6 hours, sharing memories of frozen hell and men who'd never made it home. Webb remembered the rumors about EZ-7, the whispered stories of a gunner who'd gone rogue and somehow survived. He'd always assumed the stories were exaggerated, the kind of combat myths that grew with each retelling. Meeting Kowalski, hearing the flat, emotionless recitation of events, convinced him the legends had underestimated reality. "Did you ever think about what would have happened if you'd followed the rules?" Webb asked as evening shadows stretched across the street. Kowalski had thought about it. Every day for 63 years he'd thought about it. "We would have died in the Ardennes," he said. "Me, my crew, probably half the company. The rules were designed for a different kind of war. Following them in the situation we faced would have been suicide, but you killed friendlies," Webb said quietly. "That disabled Sherman. 4 men died because you turned their tank into a smokescreen." "Yes. How do you live with that?" Kowalski watched a car drive past, some young family heading home for dinner. Living lives made possible by men who died in places they'd never heard of. "You count," he said. 4 men dead to save approximately 20. The mathematics justify the action. Whether the mathematics justify the man who made the calculation is a different question. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Webb didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. The moral calculus of combat was something that philosophers and ethicists could debate in classrooms and journals, but the men who'd actually made those decisions in real time lived with the reality that some questions couldn't be answered, only endured. Kowalski died on March 12, 2009, in his sleep, in the same bed where he'd spent thousands of nights calculating trajectories in his dreams. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of neighbors and 3 other 4th Armored Division veterans who'd made the trip to pay their respects. The VA provided an honor guard and a flag for his coffin. A bugler played taps while they lowered him into the ground next to Catherine. The obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran 4 paragraphs, mentioning his service as a tank gunner during World War II and his Distinguished Service Cross. It said nothing about the rules he'd broken, the doctrine he'd violated, the impossible decisions he'd made in impossible circumstances. Those details died with him, preserved only in military archives that most people would never read. But EZ-7's legacy lived on in ways both visible and hidden. The tank itself sat in a military museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, restored to its 1945 configuration, the turret still bearing the scars from German armor-piercing rounds that had failed to penetrate. A small placard described its service record: 17 confirmed tank kills, estimated 80 enemy infantry casualties, 0 crew fatalities. The numbers told a story, but not the complete story. The complete story was about a man who'd understood that survival sometimes required breaking the very rules designed to ensure it. About a gunner who'd calculated that killing 4 friendlies to save 20 others was mathematically sound, even if it was morally catastrophic. About a soldier who'd operated outside the system because the system was optimized for conditions that no longer existed on the frozen battlefields of Belgium. Modern armor doctrine incorporates many of the lessons Kowalski learned through trial and error in the winter of 1945. Tank crews are taught to think independently, to adapt to changing battlefield conditions, to prioritize speed and aggression over rigid adherence to procedure. The language has changed. They call it mission-type tactics now, or decentralized command. But the underlying principle is the same. Sometimes you have to break the rules to win. But doctrine manuals don't talk about the cost of that approach. They don't mention the sleepless nights or the moral weight of decisions made in combat. They don't address the question that haunted Kowalski for 63 years. If breaking the rules achieves better results, what does that say about the rules? And what does it say about the men willing to break them? The 4th Armored Division Association held a reunion every year, drawing fewer and fewer attendees as the veterans aged and passed away. In 2010, 1 year after Kowalski's death, someone proposed a memorial scholarship in honor of EZ-7's crew. The scholarship would go to descendants of 4th Armored veterans pursuing careers in mathematics or engineering, fields that required the kind of analytical thinking that Kowalski had applied to gunnery. The proposal passed unanimously, and the first scholarship was awarded in 2011 to the great-granddaughter of a tanker who'd served alongside EZ-7 during the Hufalles engagement. She used the scholarship to study mechanical engineering at Penn State, eventually working for a defense contractor designing fire control systems for modern armored vehicles. The technology was vastly more sophisticated than anything Kowalski had access to: laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, automated target tracking. But the fundamental problem remained the same. How do you hit what you're aiming at under conditions of stress, movement, and enemy fire? Her master's thesis examined the role of human decision-making in modern armor combat, arguing that even with advanced technology, the gunner's judgment remained the critical factor in successful engagement. She never met Kowalski, never even knew his name, until she researched the scholarship's origins. But reading his archived interview, studying the tactical reports from EZ-7's engagements, she recognized something that most people missed. Kowalski wasn't a maverick or a rebel. He was an engineer who'd found himself in a situation where the established equations didn't match observed reality, and he'd revised the equations accordingly. The fact that his revisions involved killing people didn't change the analytical process. It just made the consequences of error absolute. The last surviving member of EZ-7's crew died in 2016. Jimmy Reese, the loader from Iowa, had outlived everyone else by 7 years. Before his death, he recorded an oral history with the Veterans History Project, spending 3 hours describing his experiences during the Battle of the Bulge. Most of his testimony focused on the cold, the fear, the confusion of combat operations in winter conditions. But when asked about Kowalski, Reese's tone changed. "He saved our lives," Reese said, his 92-year-old voice still carrying the flat vowels of the Midwest. "Not once, not twice, but every single time we went into combat, and he did it by ignoring every order, every regulation, every procedure that was supposed to keep us safe." I know that doesn't make sense. I know it sounds like chaos, but Daniel had this ability to see patterns, to understand what was going to happen before it happened. Following the rules would have gotten us killed. Following him kept us alive. The interviewer asked if Reese ever questioned Kowalski's decisions during combat. Reese laughed, a dry sound without much humor. "You don't question a man when he's firing blind through smoke and hitting targets you can't even see. You don't question someone who can calculate deflection and range in his head faster than you can work a mechanical computer. You just trust that he knows what he's doing and try to keep up." Did he know what he was doing? Reese was quiet for a long moment. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's what haunted him. If he'd been guessing, if he'd been lucky, maybe he could have lived with it easier. But he knew. Every round he fired, every target he killed, he'd done the math and understood the consequences. You can't carry that without it changing you. The oral history recording is available online now, part of the Library of Congress's collection of World War II veteran testimonies. It includes a photograph of Reese in his 80s, standing next to EZ-7 at the Fort Benning Museum, his hand resting on the turret where he'd loaded ammunition during the coldest winter of his life. His expression in the photo is complicated. Pride mixed with sorrow, satisfaction mixed with regret, memory mixed with mortality. Historical analysis of the Battle of the Bulge continues to evolve as new documents are declassified and new analytical tools are applied to old questions. In 2018, a military historian published a detailed study of armor engagements during the Ardennes offensive, using computer modeling to evaluate tactical decisions made by both Allied and German tank crews. EZ-7's actions at Hufalles received an entire chapter, with the historian concluding that Kowalski's unconventional tactics had been objectively optimal given battlefield conditions despite violating established doctrine in every measurable way. The study sparked debate in military circles. Critics argued that celebrating rule-breaking undermined discipline and encouraged insubordination. Supporters contended that adaptive thinking was essential in combat, and that doctrine should serve as guidance rather than gospel. The debate continued in journals and conferences, with neither side achieving consensus, because the underlying question couldn't be resolved through argument. How do you balance the need for discipline with the reality that battlefield conditions sometimes demand improvisation? Kowalski would have found the entire debate irrelevant. He hadn't broken rules to make a philosophical point or to demonstrate superior tactical thinking. He'd broken them because the alternative was death, and he'd preferred survival. The fact that his choices had broader implications for military doctrine wasn't something he'd concerned himself with during combat, and it wasn't something he'd celebrated afterward. He'd simply done what the situation required and lived with the consequence. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The real lesson of Easy 7 wasn't about tactics or doctrine, or the optimal way to employ armor in defensive operations. It was about the human cost of making decisions under impossible conditions, about the weight that competent men carry when they're forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. Kowalski had been an exceptional gunner, not because he was brave or heroic, but because he'd been willing to accept the moral burden of his own effectiveness. Modern tank gunners train with simulators that can replicate battlefield conditions with remarkable fidelity. They practice engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, firing from moving platforms, coordinating with other crew members through digital communication systems. The technology is light years beyond what Kowalski had available in 1945, but the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. When the shooting starts and lives depend on your accuracy, can you make the right decision fast enough to matter? Training doctrine now includes scenarios specifically designed to test a gunner's ability to adapt when established procedures don't fit the situation. They call it tactical decision-making under uncertainty, and it's considered a critical skill for modern armor crews. Instructors will deliberately provide incomplete information or create conditions where following standard procedure would lead to mission failure, forcing trainees to think independently and justify their deviations from doctrine. It's a formalized version of what Kowalski did instinctively in the Ardennes, sanitized and packaged for educational consumption. But simulation can't replicate the reality of knowing that your decisions will kill people. It can't teach the weight of responsibility that comes with being good at something lethal. It can't prepare you for the decades of carrying memories that don't fade and questions that don't have answers. Those lessons can only be learned through experience, and the men who learn them rarely talk about the education they've received. The intersection of competence and violence is an uncomfortable topic for societies that want to celebrate their warriors while maintaining the comforting fiction that war is about honor and sacrifice rather than efficient killing. Kowalski disrupted that fiction simply by being honest about what he'd done and why he'd done it. He hadn't fought for abstract ideals or patriotic fervor. He'd fought to keep himself and his crew alive, and he'd been extraordinarily successful at it because he'd treated combat as an engineering problem rather than a moral crusade. That honesty made him difficult to mythologize. The military wanted heroes who could be held up as examples of valor and dedication. Kowalski was a man who'd killed 4 friendly soldiers to create a tactical advantage, who'd ignored his commanding officer to execute a flanking maneuver, who'd held a position not because retreat was impossible, but because he'd calculated that the defensive position offered better survival odds than attempting to break contact. Those weren't the actions of a conventional hero. They were the actions of someone who'd prioritized outcomes over optics, effectiveness over adherence to norms. The Distinguished Service Cross citation that hung in a frame in his house had described his actions as extraordinary heroism in combat against an armed enemy. The language was formulaic, designed to fit the bureaucratic requirements of military awards. What it didn't mention was the mathematical precision with which he'd killed, the systematic violation of regulations, the moral complexity of decisions that saved lives by ending others. The citation told a truth, but not the complete truth, because the complete truth didn't fit into the narrative framework that militaries use to make sense of combat. Kowalski had understood this disconnect. He'd accepted the medal because refusing it would have created more complications than accepting it. But he'd never worn the ribbon on his uniform, and he'd never mentioned the award to anyone who didn't already know about it. The medal represented recognition from a system he'd systematically undermined, praise from an institution whose rules he'd broken as a matter of routine practice. The irony was too obvious to require comment. In the final years of his life, Kowalski had developed a habit of visiting the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh every Tuesday afternoon. He'd sit in the reading room and work through mathematics journals, following developments in fields he'd never formally studied, but had applied in the most consequential way possible. He'd never gone to college, never taken advanced mathematics courses, but he'd developed an intuitive understanding of ballistics and geometry that matched or exceeded what trained engineers knew theoretically. A librarian had noticed his regular presence and struck up a conversation one afternoon. She'd asked what drew him to mathematics, expecting some answer about intellectual curiosity or lifelong learning. Kowalski had told her the truth. Math was the only thing that made sense. It didn't require interpretation or justification. Numbers followed rules absolutely, and when you applied those rules correctly, you got predictable results. Unlike everything else in life, mathematics didn't involve moral ambiguity or uncertainty. It just was. The librarian had found the answer sad in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Here was an old man who'd found comfort in abstraction because concrete reality was too complicated to bear. She'd wanted to tell him that life was about more than rules and calculations, that human experience couldn't be reduced to equations. But something in his expression had stopped her. He looked like a man who'd learned lessons she'd never have to face, and who bore those lessons with a quiet dignity that precluded easy sympathy. EZ-7 sits in its museum display behind velvet ropes and plexiglass barriers, the 75mm gun elevated at an angle that suggests eternal vigilance. School groups pass through regularly, children staring at the tank with the casual interest of people who've never had to consider what it means to be inside one during combat. Tour guides explain the Sherman's technical specifications, its service record, the significance of armored warfare during World War II. They mention that this particular tank had an exceptional combat record, 17 confirmed kills, and that it was crewed by men who showed extraordinary courage under fire. What they don't mention, because it's not in the official display materials, is that the tank's success came from systematic violation of every principle of military discipline. They don't talk about the gunner who'd killed friendlies, who'd ignored orders, who'd treated combat as a mathematics problem and solved it with ruthless efficiency. Those details are preserved in archives and academic papers, available to anyone willing to dig through historical records, but they're not part of the public story because they complicate the narrative in ways that make people uncomfortable. The truth is that EZ-7's success and Kowalski's methods are inseparable, and both are products of a specific moment in history when conventional approaches failed and improvisation became survival. You can't celebrate one without acknowledging the other, and acknowledging the other requires confronting uncomfortable questions about the nature of military discipline, the cost of effectiveness, and the price that competent men pay when their competence is directed toward lethal ends. Those questions don't have satisfying answers. They didn't in 1945, they didn't when Kowalski died in 2009, and they don't now. What we're left with is the record. One Sherman, one crew, one gunner, who understood that surviving the unsurvivable sometimes meant breaking every rule designed to keep you safe. Whether that makes him a hero or something more complicated is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What's certain is that Staff Sergeant Daniel Kowalski was one of the most effective tank gunners in the European theater during World War II, that his methods saved lives at terrible cost, and that he carried the weight of his own effectiveness for 63 years without seeking absolution or offering excuses. He did what the situation required, lived with the consequences, and took his final calculations to a grave in Pittsburgh, where no memorial marks his unconventional service. The Panzer Battalion that EZ-7 helped destroy at Hufalles never reformed. The survivors were folded into other units, the equipment losses never fully replaced. In the grand strategic picture of World War II, one tank's success barely registered. But for the crews that EZ-7 fought alongside, for the infantry that advanced under its covering fire, for the men who lived because Kowalski broke every rule that should have gotten them killed, the impact was absolute and undeniable. Mathematics doesn't care about convention. Trajectories don't recognize authority. Physics operates identically whether you follow regulations or violate them. Kowalski had understood these truths in a way that most men never have to, and he'd applied them in the frozen hell of the Ardennes with precision that bordered on supernatural. The cost was measurable in bodies, both enemy and friendly. The benefit was measurable in lives saved and battles won. The moral balance sheet doesn't reconcile, and anyone who claims it does is selling something. What remains, decades after the last shot was fired, is memory fading into history, transformed into lessons sanitized for consumption by people who will never face the choices that defined Kowalski's war. EZ-7 endures as metal and myth, a testament to effectiveness divorced from conventional virtue, proof that survival and heroism don't always overlap the way we'd prefer them to. And somewhere in the archives, on deteriorating magnetic tape, Kowalski's voice explains that regret is irrelevant when you're calculating deflection angles for targets that will kill you if you miss. The mathematics justified the action. Whether the mathematics justified the man remains a question he never answered, because some equations don't have solutions, only results you learn to carry until the weight becomes part of who you are. That's the truth that doesn't fit in medals or museum displays or simplified narratives of World War II valor. It's the truth of a tank gunner who ignored every rule, outlived a Panzer Battalion, and spent the rest of his life working through the mathematics of decisions that can't be reduced to right or wrong, only to necessary and costly. The Sherman's gun is silent now, pointed at nothing, its fighting days preserved in climate-controlled permanence. But for 4 years in the winter of 1945, that gun spoke with Daniel Kowalski's voice, and what it said was simple and terrible. Survival requires calculations that break more than regulations. The years immediately after Kowalski's death brought an unexpected development. In 2011, a grandson he'd barely known, the son of a daughter from Catherine's first marriage, began researching the family history. Michael Torres was a Marine Corps captain, serving his second tour in Afghanistan, commanding a mechanized infantry unit that operated LAV-25 light armored vehicles in Helmand province. He'd grown up hearing vague stories about his step-grandfather's war service, but the old man had died before Michael deployed, and they'd never had the kind of conversation that veterans sometimes share across generations. What Michael found in the National Archives changed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about combat leadership. The after-action reports, the interview transcripts, the tactical analyses, all of it painted a picture of a man who'd operated so far outside established parameters that his success seemed almost accidental. Except it wasn't accidental. Every deviation from doctrine had been calculated, every rule broken for specific tactical advantage. Michael recognized the pattern because he was living a version of it in Afghanistan, where counterinsurgency operations required constant adaptation, and where following the book often meant failing the mission. He requested copies of every document related to EZ-7's service record. The stack of papers arrived 3 months later, hundreds of pages of declassified reports that read like a manual on unconventional warfare, written 70 years before anyone formalized the concept. Michael spent his off-duty hours studying Kowalski's methods, looking for principles that might translate across eras and conflicts. What he found was both simpler and more complex than he'd anticipated. The principle was straightforward. Doctrine exists to provide structure for average personnel in average situations, but exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses. Kowalski hadn't been rebelling against authority or demonstrating maverick tendencies. He'd been solving problems using the tools and methods that produced optimal outcomes, regardless of whether those methods aligned with established procedure. The complexity came from recognizing when circumstances justified deviation and having the moral courage to accept responsibility for the consequences. Michael started incorporating some of Kowalski's tactical concepts into his own operations in Afghanistan. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger command attention, just small adjustments to patrol patterns and engagement protocols that gave his Marines more autonomy to respond to battlefield conditions. The results were measurable: fewer casualties, more successful engagements, better intelligence gathering. His battalion commander noticed and asked what had changed. Michael explained that he'd been studying his grandfather's armor tactics from World War II and adapting them to modern mechanized infantry operations. The commander's response was unexpected. Instead of criticism for deviating from standard operating procedures, Michael received permission to formalize his adaptations into a training program for the entire battalion. By 2012, elements of Kowalski's 70-year-old tactical innovations were being taught to Marines preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, translated into modern context, but preserving the core principle: rigid adherence to doctrine in dynamic situations gets people killed. Michael tried to contact other EZ-7 crew members to learn more about his grandfather, but by then only Reese was still alive, and the old loader's health was failing. They managed one phone conversation before Reese died, 20 minutes of halting discussion that gave Michael more questions than answers. Reese's final words stayed with him. "Your grandfather understood something that most men never learn. War isn't about following rules. It's about making the right decision in the 2 seconds you have before the decision makes itself." He was better at those 2 seconds than anyone I ever knew. The Marine Corps awarded Michael a Bronze Star for his innovative tactical leadership in Afghanistan. The citation mentioned his ability to adapt established doctrine to meet evolving battlefield conditions, which was essentially a formal recognition of the same qualities that had made Kowalski both effective and controversial 70 years earlier. Michael kept the medal in the same drawer as his grandfather's Distinguished Service Cross, two pieces of metal representing the same fundamental truth. Sometimes the military rewards you for breaking the rules it claims are inviolable. When Michael returned from Afghanistan in 2013, he was assigned to the Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group at Quantico, where he helped develop doctrine for future mechanized operations. He brought Kowalski's combat reports with him and used them as case studies in tactical decision-making seminars. The instructors were initially skeptical. What could World War II armor tactics teach modern Marines about contemporary warfare? But once they studied the actual decisions Kowalski had made, the geometry of his fire solutions, the way he'd used terrain and timing to create advantages, they recognized that the principles were timeless. One instructor, a colonel who'd commanded armor in Iraq, put it succinctly, "This sergeant was doing mission command before we had a name for it. He was operating inside the enemy's decision cycle, creating chaos in their formations while maintaining coherence in his own. That's not luck, that's not even skill. That's intellectual dominance applied through violence." Kanai Atomai.